I didn't get around to playing Metroid Zero Mission until December of 2010. My mom had been hiding my unwrapped Christmas gifts in a closet in our sunroom, and one day I snuck in and found my gifts early. Among them was a Metroid Zero Mission cartridge, and I remember trying to be silent while freaking out and looking at it. I was a little bastard. I sneakily brought my red Game Boy Advance SP into the room and played it without my mom noticing. I remember feeling so excited to try the game out, and I decided to take a sneak peek at the save file that was already on the cartridge. That save file happened to be in the room right before Mother Brain, so my first time playing this game started there. I was already pretty good at the game since it controls similarly to Fusion, and I managed to beat what I thought was the final boss after just a few minutes. Imagine my surprise when the game kept going, and I found myself in an entirely new area. I didn't want to get caught looking at my presents, so I'd only take a few more little peeks before returning the game back to where I found it. When Christmas morning finally came, I opened the gift and pretended like I was so surprised to see that I got Zero Mission for Christmas. I was a little shithead. Mom, if you ever hear this, I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But now that I could play this game out in the open, I took my time with it from the beginning. The only thing that I remember from my first playthrough is that I absolutely adored everything about the game. And then I got stuck at this one part with this Kirugiru larva at my grandparents' house. I'd go on to replay this game constantly, as I did with all the other Metroid games. Zero Mission is widely considered one of the best remakes of all time, and it often ranks high among favorite Metroid games for many fans. If you know this game, you're likely well aware of its reputation. If you've seen my previous videos, then you should be familiar with my approach to discussing these games. I don't feel the need to continue to repeat my usual song and dance about choosing not to view this game in the context of its release. I'm hoping to use this video as an opportunity to dissect this game both as a remake of the original title, but also examine how it measures as a game on its own merits. I'd like to take a closer look at Zero to see if I can find a greater understanding and appreciation for what exactly this game does to earn its reputation. It's probably my second most replayed game of all time behind Prime, so there's clearly something about this game that I can't get enough of. By the end of this video, I hope to find an answer to identify what it is that makes this game so special to me. To put it plainly, Zero Mission is one of the best looking games in the series. I believe this game's visuals transcend the hardware of the GBA. Especially when viewed on an original screen, Zero's visuals have not aged a single day for embracing a more stylized art direction. Zero's visuals are often described as being comparable to something you might see out of a comic book, with solid black lines and this striking use of vibrant colors. Backgrounds are drawn in a more abstract manner, using brighter outlines to contrast a dark canvas. Certain backgrounds, such as Ridley's hideout or Crateria, use multi-layered effects to mimic depth in this game world. That's hardly unique to this game, but this feature always works incredibly well for enhancing the visuals of 2D platformers. Many of the Chozo settlement remnants now feature a wealth of environmental set dressing, like statues and hieroglyphs in the background to characterize the world of Zebes. We're shown that these Chozo are similar to what we had seen before in Super Metroid, only now we're given even more detail to learn about who these Chozo were. I especially enjoy the frequent use of Chozo faces and general depictions of the Chozo themselves. This shows a proud culture, the work of decorated architects. Places like Chozodia are abandoned, but they're not yet dilapidated. Wildlife has virtually no presence, and most of the sandstone is still well preserved. This is consistent with what Samus describes in the opening, saying that she once called Zebes her home. Areas like Ridley, Kraid, and Norfair, however, are packed with a variety of dangerous alien life, and the structures are in disrepair. Super Metroid's detailed approach to depicting ruins is even further evolved in Zero's environment design, and it contrasts nicely against places like Chozodia and the many naturalistic alien caves. As I went over in my Metroid Fusion video, the original Game Boy Advance changed the actual color values displayed on the screen. Developers accounted for this by carefully color correcting games so that the displayed colors would balance out for the intended look of the game. I'm again using RetroArch and MGBA to record my footage, and the shader approximates the look of how these games actually look when played on original hardware. It's an unfortunate consequence of playing these games outside of their original hardware, and I maintain my position of choosing not to criticize the game itself for this color snafu. When played on original hardware, and hell, even when played on something like the Virtual Console, this game looks absolutely phenomenal. I'd even say that the game still looks great even when played without the color correction, something I'd also say about Fusion to a lesser extent. No matter how you play Zero, the visuals on offer are sure to please the eye. Zero's controls are ridiculously satisfying. The controls are mostly similar to Fusion, but they've been adjusted to better suit a faster and more non-linear adventure. Zero makes everything from Fusion feel snappier, refining Fusion's controls even further. They've also added shooting from a ledge grab, which is surprisingly useful for further expanding platform challenge opportunities in the level design. Your running and jumping are now more sensitive and responsive, and this makes even your basic movement through this world feel more intrinsically satisfying. These controls work especially well with the game world because this world is built around giving you a higher skill ceiling. Being able to barrel around and platform at high speed takes a mastery of the tight movement, and everything about the way Samus controls feels deliberately designed to give skilled players a lot to work with. For example, landing lag is basically non-existent, meaning a skilled player can carefully platform even right next to an enemy as long as they're skilled enough to move precisely. Additionally, infinite bomb jumping and single wall scaling are both reintroduced in this game. Unsurprisingly, both of these moves are also much snappier than their Super Metroid counterparts, making their application feel even more satisfying to master. I love titles like the Prime games and Return of Samus for slowing things down to focus on the strengths that come with that kind of design, but it's great that Zero reintroduced that fast-paced gameplay of some of the older games like NES or Super. Players are more than welcome to have their own preferences on this matter, but it's important to recognize the validity and merits of both approaches. I appreciate that even in 2004, Nintendo understood the value in each design philosophy and released these games alongside one another. Zero's controls succeed in enhancing the design goals of the original game by rewarding speedy gameplay, but they also stand on their own merits as tight, responsive, and especially fun in their own right. Of the games discussed so far, this is easily the best control offering yet. Of course, Zero's soundtrack has many remixes of tunes from the original game. Much of what I said about these tracks in my NES Metroid video remains true in this game, with an excellent combination of adventurous heroism complemented by a deliciously foreboding atmosphere. These contrasting elements represent the dangerous alien world and the capable hero respectively. The title screen is a great example of both dread and optimism existing within the same song. Translating these 8-bit tracks into a higher fidelity granted the designers an opportunity to characterize these levels with new instrumentation. Many tracks, such as Brinstar and Norfair, use lots of choir to parallel the Chozo. Seeing as this remake places more emphasis on the Chozo, I think it's neat to hear updated versions of older tracks reflect that. Zero Mission's music often receives criticism for sounding muffled, with low-quality samples. As I understand it, the Game Boy Advance did not have any dedicated sound hardware. Sound processing would apparently happen straight off the GBA's CPU. I don't know the finer details, but I do take notice of how this affects many GBA games. As far as Zero in particular goes, I can say I certainly took notice of the compressed sound even as a kid. It might be noticeable, but I don't think this compression comes anywhere near ruining the music. I've heard plenty of players online say that this straight up ruins the music for them, or that there's basically no atmosphere in this game because of the brighter visuals and compressed music. I find it harsh to write off the entire soundtrack over this issue. There's so much to appreciate about this soundtrack, even considering the compression issue. Just about every single track in this game is a massive improvement over the original songs to my ears. I don't actually have much to say about many of the individual tracks, since they all serve the same purposes that they did in the NES game, but everything from the composition to the instrumentation is wonderful on the ears. One track in particular deserves special mention, and that's Kraid's theme. This theme is one of the best in the series for masterfully capturing that foreboding atmosphere in a moody melody. Kraid's theme goes hard. track that I prefer in the original game is perhaps the item room theme. This is the one track where the compression feels genuinely distracting to me, and there's something about the eeriness of the original that I prefer. The new tracks in this game include the new boss themes, which fit so well that I don't think I'd be able to tell that they're new if I hadn't played the original. These boss tracks perfectly capture the feeling of some large, imposing monster attacking you. The music doesn't make me feel like I want to escape, it instead motivates me to fight back. The new Criteria level has an atmospheric and ominous track to contrast this area against the rest of the game world. The epilogue also has its own original tracks. The two new main tracks complement each other with a tense ambience to backdrop your sneaking around. As soon as you get spotted, a tense remix of Super's Space Pirate theme kicks in, signaling your sudden danger. To wrap up the music segment, I'll say that Zero Mission offers a varied score with a range of music contextual to both the environments and the story moments. Things stay interesting and energetic for nearly all of the adventure, only slowing down to unsettle the player with an eerie ambience. Zero Mission's music runs circles around the original game and offers a thrilling backdrop to your adventure every step of the way. The samples could be of a higher quality, but it's hard for me to care that much when this game is firing on all cylinders by every other metric. Zero Mission adopts the same minimalist story approach that the first three games used, and this is every bit as valid as the other storytelling methods in comparison to games like Prime or Fusion. I love those other kinds of stories, but I appreciate that Zero declines to compromise on its design goals by sticking to story methods that better suit the fast pace and replayable style of its gameplay. Fusion's mere existence shows us that tons of text in a Metroid game certainly was possible on the Game Boy Advance. But Zero chooses not to embrace this potential because it recognizes the strengths of its own design philosophy. Metroid could and should be so much more than any one idea, both in story and in gameplay, so I celebrate this variety. Zero embraces the minimalism from the early games with its own comic-style flair, making for something entirely its own in the series. Before I get into the story itself, I have to again give Zero appreciation for its phenomenal storytelling methodology for being compatible with its gameplay experience. In my Fusion video, I mentioned this excellent video from Transparency. Before we get into Zero Mission's story itself, I want to again recommend and credit that same video for initially covering this topic, and doing it far better than I ever could. They introduced these ideas in a way that felt like it finally put some of my grievances with the Metroid narrative into cohesion. It was cathartic to hear it broken down in such an efficient and effective way. Though my thoughts are certainly still my own, I still again want to give proper credit to this video for inspiring my ideas discussed here. If what I discuss sounds interesting to you, then I recommend you go check out their video for a deeper dive into this topic. Being a remake, you'd likely not expect much to say about this story. The interesting thing about Zero is that this game retcons not only major story components of NES Metroid, but consequently the entire overarching narrative of the series as well. Right from the opening, Samus now mentions that Zebes was once her home. And the game will also explicitly show us Samus being raised on Zebes as a child by the Chozo. For those playing this game after the original, this is quite the revelation. I can't discuss this situation much further without first bringing up the Japan-only Metroid manga. In 2003, Japanese players were treated to 2 volumes detailing the origins of the Metroid series. Many elements of the series are massively retconned with this new continuity from the manga. Zebes is no longer some alien world, it's Samus's home. The mysterious, unnamed ancient race are actually called the Chozo, and they raised Samus here on Zebes just a few years ago. Mother Brain is no stranger. She was there on Zebes when Samus was a child. Mother Brain is apparently also Chozo technology. Metroids are not some otherworldly phenomenon of unknown origin. They were created by the very same Chozo that raised Samus. Ridley is also no stranger to Samus. He was the person that killed Samus's biological and adoptive parents. I discussed this previously in my Fusion video, but connecting all of these characters like this does far more harm than any good for world building, in my opinion. When so many of the places and characters that Samus encounters already have multiple connections to her, it makes this world feel so much smaller. I don't believe we need all of the answers to these kinds of questions, because part of the appeal of Metroid to me is that I enjoy merely speculating on the unknown. I think the Chozo creating Metroids could work, because Metroid 2 detailed these two groups already having a connection from the outset. But by having Samus return to her childhood home in the events of Zero Mission, facing characters like Ridley and Mother Brain that have wronged her, it retells the original game as a story of revenge in the name of her family and home. The entire universe now revolves around Samus for being some special Chozo prodigy, seemingly destined to avenge her people. The Chozo never mattered to the overarching narrative, but this new lore centers around them. The Chozo were never named or mentioned once in NES, Return of Samus, Super, Fusion, or even Other M a single time. The mysteries of the Chozo was kind of the whole point of them, in my opinion, but that mystery is now gone from the word go. Additionally, writing that the space pirates killed both Samus's biological and adoptive parents paints them as straight up cartoonishly evil. The space pirates never actually do anything explicitly evil a single time in any of the 4 original 2D Metroid games, something that could serve their purpose in the narrative as a potentially misunderstood faction labeled dangerous by the government. They might steal the Metroids to achieve their goals, but there was plenty of room to interpret them any number of ways in light of Fusion's revelations. The manuals might depict them as malicious, but as was the case with the Metroids in the Manual of Return of Samus, it turns out that we're not meant to take everything the Federation says at face value. The Chozo are written to be incapable of harming others without causing tremendous pain to themselves as well. Before Zero Mission, there was no reason to believe that the Chozo of the 2D Metroid games were these all-encompassing do-gooders. They're heaps of deadly combat equipment and environmental remnants of battles and strongholds depicted them vaguely as warriors. But with Zero Mission, the characters of this world now feel completely black and white in terms of morality and purpose. I'd like to briefly recap the overarching narrative to better illustrate my point. In Metroid 1, the story is incredibly simple and seemingly black and white. Good guys versus bad guys. Metroid 2 asks a question at the very end of the game, forcing Samus and the player to reconsider their actions and their perspective on the characters of the universe. Are Metroids really these evil abominations as described in the manual? Super Metroid shows us that Metroids have empathy, and the game tells us a story about the power struggle between the Federation's pawn and the space pirates. If Metroid 2 was the question, then Fusion is the answer, as the Federation now attempts to fill the power vacuum with their own secret Metroid breeding project. Samus and the player were wrong to see the world as so black and white, and that's why you faced a figurative and literal version of your own past in Fusion. Samus was challenged with coming to terms with her misdeeds and growing as a character. She became the Metroid being hunted by Samus. Samus was fighting the reflection of how she looked and acted in Super Metroid because she must confront her dark past. Her perspective was challenged in a way that simply cannot occur if she is the righteous hero from the beginning, as depicted in Zero Mission. If you're righteous from the start, then there is no past to confront and no character growth. The themes of the whole 2D series are tossed aside in favor of some world building that makes the world feel small. Samus saves her family home in one game, and then exterminates an entire race in the sequel. What was once a cohesive thematic through-line is now a hodgepodge of completely different ideas, and it feels to me like they really do not mix very well together at all. Zero Mission rewriting the narrative as incredibly cartoonishly black and white is such a middle finger to the overarching narrative of the series, in my opinion. Regardless of whether or not you enjoy this new lore on its own merits, so much is already lost by choosing to experience this story with this new lore. It doesn't please me to say it, but this disregard for preserving the narrative is easily my greatest issue with Zero Mission, and I still think this new lore is perhaps my greatest frustration with the Metroid series as a whole. There's an argument to be made that Zero Mission had a responsibility to follow up on the manga and shouldn't carry much blame for these new story elements. I choose to criticize Zero anyways because this game repeatedly references and depicts these story elements in gallery images, dialogue, and in cutscenes. How much this disregard for the original lore even matters to you is going to vary wildly depending on who you ask, so I totally get why plenty of people will probably disagree with me on this particular issue. Setting aside my grievances with Zero stomping all over the original narrative, it's also worth examining this lore on its own merits. But I do think it offers its own interesting story of a tragic hero. Something I also brought up in my Fusion video is that Samus's entire life has been experiencing loss after loss. Her biological parents, her Chozo parents, both K2L and Zebes, the larva Metroid, Adam, she just keeps losing everyone close to her. Despite all of these hardships, Samus maintains an unwavering resolve to protect the galaxy and act selflessly. Samus might be stoic, but she's far from heartless. All of what I described is hardly unique to this continuity, but I appreciate that her backstory strengthens her resolve to do good in this world. The new lore introduced in Zero fleshes Samus herself out as well, whether that be through dialogue or small story scenes. Samus makes for an interesting protagonist on separate merits when you can spend more time informing the player on her motivation. Zero defines Samus as a character through more traditional means, and this still at least works as its own thing. Zero Mission doesn't do much more than that, so there really isn't much to examine here beyond appreciating a fairly by-the-numbers story. Zero Mission is not a story-focused game. It does more damage to the larger series than it does its own game, so this story ends up working just fine in a vacuum. The fact that this game introduces so much, while also barely using any of it, is kind of a problem. They bring in all of these new ideas through gallery images and brief cutscenes, but they don't expand on any of these ideas or flesh them out very much in the game itself. They rely on the manga to do all of the heavy lifting, and that's especially frustrating when that manga has never even been released outside of Japan. Very little is gained here from introducing these retcons, and yet so much is lost. I'm sure that the Prime games have come to mind as I've gone over my issues with Zero. They're not exactly the same, but Zero Mission and the Prime trilogy all show explicit disregard for preserving the thematic, narrative, and tonal through lines of the 2D Metroid games. Canonicity aside, there are a ton of things about the Prime games that feel like they really don't care to maintain continuity or consistency with the 2D games. The Prime games do things like rewrite the Pirates, Federation, and Chozo as characters completely unique to that sub-series, or use characters like Ridley and the Metroids so often that it feels to me like they carry all the sincerity and tension of a Saturday morning cartoon. The Prime games similarly depict Samus as a virtuous hero, during a point in the timeline in which her morality is unclear, and even early versions of Prime 1 have the same story element of Samus being raised by the Chozo. I choose not to criticize Metroid Prime as harshly for disregarding the cohesion of the 2D games because I think that the Prime games are mostly meant to be taken as separate stories. Prime is clearly committing to doing its own thing as a separate sub-series, and I think it's better off for it. It's totally valid to disagree, or for someone to decide to criticize Prime in this way. But I personally am more forgiving of the Prime sub-series, ignoring the continuity of the 2D games. There's a whole other conversation to be had about the fact that Prime is selectively trying to maintain consistency with the 2D series, so perhaps the Prime games do deserve criticism in that regard. Both writing teams have gone back and forth about whether or not they care to maintain consistency with their counterparts, and I think the writing in the games makes this apparent. Since Zero Mission is a literal remake of a game from that 2D series, I think it's far more offensive for it to disrespect that 2D series. Reflecting on Zero Mission's story as a whole, this is easily the biggest way that the NES game completely blows the remake out of the water. That mysterious simplicity lends itself well to serving its purpose in the overarching narrative, and I also find it more engaging on its own merits. NES Metroid's universe feels large and mysterious. Zero Mission completely drops the ball in terms of world building and lore in relation to the larger series, but is serviceable in a vacuum. I dislike world building that shrinks the universe, and I mostly dislike stories about a destined hero, so I'm sure your mileage will vary. For all that has changed in this remake, the layout of the world itself and the placement of the items has been kept largely intact. There are plenty of minor changes here and there within these levels, but this is almost the same planet Zebes from the original game. Of my many gripes with the NES game, world design was certainly not one of them. I thought Planet Zebes was great for offering many interconnected pathways, and being built as a fairly small but exploration-focused world that valued your time, at least through its layout. Zero Mission's adherence to the original room and item placement lends this game all of the benefits and drawbacks of that original game. Most of what I discussed in my NES Metroid video remains true, so this segment is mostly self-explanatory. In short, this world is every bit as sprawling and interconnected as Metroid should be. Zero did also introduce entire new segments of the world. I will talk about one of them in its own segment, but Crateria is seamlessly integrated into the rest of Zebes because they interconnected it to nearly all of the other levels. There's actually not that much going on inside of Crateria itself, housing just 2 progression items collected back to back before you basically never need to visit this area again. This level is a great addition for the sake of adding even more variety to Planet Zebes and establishing continuity with Super Metroid. I'll get into plenty of things that Zero did change from the original as the video continues, but it's interesting to see this remake commit to preserving the original's world design. Item progression fell to the wayside around the first 30 minutes or so in the NES game, with bombs opening the majority of the map. Item progression was hardly the focus of that original game, because that game favored hardly defining a sequence to facilitate open exploration. Zero demonstrates a completely different design philosophy as early as the second item, placing in multiple item checks for long beam in what were previously completely unrestricted areas. Your explorable area is far more contingent on your arsenal than it ever was in the NES game, and this focus persists for the majority of the game. Before I even discuss how Zero executes on this idea, it's worth pointing out that redesigning the game like this in the first place lessens much of what made NES Metroid unique from all of the other Metroid games. I appreciated the NES game's freeform simplicity. Its loose progression offered its own take on the familiar Metroid gameplay formula. Regardless of how well Zero Mission pulls off emulating a more traditional Metroid progression philosophy, something is already lost by attempting that in the first place. Much of NES Metroid's identity and individuality are defined by the deviations made from the rest of the series. Love it or hate it, unrestricted navigation and loose progression are 2 massive defining traits of NES Metroid. Zero's design philosophy is instead nearly identical to that of Super Metroid's approach, as Zero Mission has an intended item ordering sequence for players to follow. This heavy focus on item contingent progression means that every moment of exploration is informed by your moveset and arsenal. As is the case in games like Prime or Dread, you're almost always assessing your explorable area not only to identify explorable pathways, but also to make sense of why you can't reach other paths. I've been over this kind of gameplay loop a few times before by now, so I don't feel the need to explain this dynamic in depth. I'll say that this is every bit as mechanically immersive and addicting as it was in the other Metroid games, like Super and Prime. The more traditional gameplay loop of the Metroidvania genre is alive and well in Zero Mission, and it's fantastic stuff as always. Zero's more traditional progression makes nearly every one of its progression items a required item during a normal run. Previously optional items like Long Beam, Wave Beam, and Variasuit are now all required. As was the case in Super Metroid, items previously inconsequential to your exploration are given new explorative application in the form of their unique interactions with the level design. The Variasuit now protects you against superheated rooms, for example. There are some oddities here, such as the 3 new required unknown items found throughout your journey. These 3 items are incompatible with your suit, and yet you must pick all of them up anyways, because each of them allows you to destroy specific tiles with matching symbols. Because they offer no benefits to the player otherwise, these items may as well be literal keys for the majority of your game time. I suppose it would have been nice if they found new places to stick these items in to make them work more naturally in the progression, but I don't think that was ever going to happen since this game committed so hard to preserving the original world layout. As it is now, it's not terribly interesting, but I also don't find it offensive either. It makes for a fun power trip at the end of the game, if nothing else. Progression on the whole is well done in Zero for sticking to what worked in Super. Regardless of execution, however, this is completely unlike the NES game. Part of me wants this game to have committed to preserving that more open and loose structure of the NES game, but I still enjoy the approach that Zero does take. I wasn't able to identify many sequence-breaking opportunities in NES Metroid because there really wasn't much of any outlined sequence in the first place. Zero's progression sequence is far more defined, so potential for breaks is much higher. It's interesting that despite initially seeming so much more linear than the original, the actual item ordering approaches being just as non-linear as the NES game once you factor in all of the many sequence breaks. Long Beam is still completely optional if you find these hidden destructible tiles. Variasuit can be reached early if you locate this area to perform multiple IBJs in a row over an acid pit. The screw attack can be collected early in multiple ways, including a well-placed shine spark here, or even a tricky hidden missile block there. Super missiles can be collected early with some tricky morph ball shine sparking in multiple locations. Ridley can be fought first with a secret hidden pathway in Norfair, and all but 9 items can be outright skipped if the player takes advantage of multiple secret pathways placed into the world. There are so many intuitive sequence breaks in this game that the progression ends up being amongst the most non-linear in the series, especially the most non-linear amongst sandbox games that bother outlining a sequence in the first place. Zero Mission is an absolute sequence-breaking playground, with absurd opportunity hidden within this world. This adds an insane amount of replay value to this game, and there's so much more to explore for since you're also able to spend time picking the map and progression apart to identify these hidden pathways. Sequence breaking in Zero often gets criticized for shifting focus away from simply performing moves like the wall jump in order to break a sequence. More than any other game in the series, many of Zero's breaks rely on the player being knowledgeable of secret pathways more than executing on tricky maneuvers. I don't want to misrepresent this criticism, perhaps there's some part of it that I'm just not getting, but the issue that many players seem to take with this kind of sequence breaking is that these hidden pathways feel cheap or comparatively uninteresting. From what I can gather, some players like to feel like they're breaking the developer's intended experience when they sequence break, and Zero offering these hidden pathways hardly feels like breaking anything because it's obvious that these breaks are designed. Other players have criticized this kind of sequence breaking for feeling too difficult. They preferred the idea that merely knowing how to wall jump is all there is to conquering the challenge. I prefer developer-intended sequence breaks because they are deliberately and intuitively designed around testing your navigational skills in relation to your moveset, in combination with sometimes executing on niche but intuitive movement deck. The whole point for me is that it's within the realm of intuition, though not necessarily through conventional wisdom. Zero often approaches intuitive sequence breaking differently than Super, by asking the player to discover many hidden pathways in the game world. I know that these breaks are seen as inferior to something like Super's breaks, but my hot take is that Zero's approach to sequence breaking is perhaps even more interesting than Super. As discussed in my Super video, I don't want sequence breaking to mostly be performing the same basic wall jumping moves in more obvious spots. There are a few IBJ and shine sparking tricks in Super, but outside of glitches, it's shockingly rare for this game to ask you to think outside of the box to break a sequence. Merely knowing how to wall jump automates the majority of the intuitive sequence breaks, and I can't help but see that as missed potential. I still adore Super's sequence breaking, but many of the breaks feel relatively samey to me for repeatedly testing you in the same way. Huge part of the Metroid games for me is searching around for hidden pathways in the game world, whether those paths are required or not. In Zero, it's very possible for a player to accidentally stumble across one of these pathways without even understanding its purpose. You're first tested with searching for these pathways, but you're then tasked with demonstrating your understanding of the map in relation to the item progression to make the connection that sequence breaking is even possible in these areas. This giant hidden path in Norfair connects a late game area to an early game area, and it's up to the player to take notice and make the connection. You might find the back end of this tunnel near the end of the game, and your knowledge is tested because it's up to you to take notice of the potential for this path to be reachable in the early game. You have to locate these pathways and assess how they relate to the normal progression path. These areas connect in such a way that doesn't actually require many of those late game items, and you're only going to notice that if you're thinking carefully about how the different areas of the game world connect to each other and how the item logic affects everything. I am baffled that these kinds of sequence breaks are seen as a negative, because testing my searching skills, my map knowledge, my navigational skills, my understanding of how Samus's arsenal relates to and interacts with the game world. All of this is such a huge part of what makes the Metroid games so much fun for me personally. That process of treating the entire map like a puzzle, combing over everything to identify sequence breaking opportunities, is exactly what makes sequence breaking so much fun to me. I feel like the potential of sequence breaking is being expanded in such an interesting way here. I want to be given challenging opportunities to demonstrate my mastery over the world itself, and that challenge opportunity is realized in these kinds of breaks. Zero also offers a greater variety of movement techniques to perform in order to break a sequence. Yes, there are your familiar wall jumping opportunities, but now you actually get to use IBJs beyond some specific niche moments. IBJs are needed both for Varia and for early Ridley, giving this technique far more time in the spotlight than it ever got in Super. Shine Sparking also gets more than one chance to shine, and it even gets using a ball spark into a diagonal surface to further diversify the challenge. The alternate early Super Missile in Criteria even requires wall jumping after recharging a Shine Spark. All of that combined to offer a far more varied means of breaking this game, and I find it more memorable as a result. Testing my item and level knowledge, testing how these mechanics relate to and interact with each other. That is what Zero's sequence breaking is all about. I can understand how your individual tastes might make you prefer Super's breaks, but I really don't get what makes Zero's breaks so bad to some people. No fucking way is this sequence breaking anything less than phenomenal in my opinion. I'm licking the plate clean with every sequence break in Zero because this game knows exactly what I want out of an item logic focused challenge. Chozo Guide statues are unique to Zero Mission, and they're a good idea. Chozo Guides place map markers to indicate the location of the next power-up. Like Fusion and Prime, you're not shown how to get to these locations, they merely show your destination. In the beginning of the game, these statues are common and outright required a couple of times. Making these statues optional would grant the player the choice to only take whatever amount of help they feel they need, and it would clearly communicate them as an optional hint tool. Making only a few statues required for progression feels like it might send mixed messaging about player expectations, because players might suspect that they could miss something if they choose not to use them. It is worth mentioning that these statues are only required in the already easy early game, meaning they're hardly robbing you of any greater navigational challenge. Even so, making them consistently and clearly optional would have been better for allowing each player to tailor their experience to their desires in relation to player guidance. Their implementation is slightly less than ideal. I know some people feel like these statues are a much bigger deal than that, but I personally can't see them as more than a slight inconvenience. Because of Zero's sequence progression, navigation is more restrictive in comparison to the original game. The world opens more slowly with far more item checks, meaning your navigation is both easier and harder depending on how you choose to look at it. Easier because there is usually less to explore at any given time, but harder because you are now tasked with assessing the item logic far more often. This plays into everything I said about NES's looser and freeform exploration, which simply is not the case here in Zero. Zero Mission will almost never ask you to make an uninformed, large trip to reach the next item in the intended progression. Nearly all of the power-ups are within a fairly close proximity to the next location, though there are exceptions. Obtaining the speed booster in Kraid's lair will task you with traveling all the way back to Norfair to break this floor. Getting high jump boots will task you with traveling to Brinstar to obtain Varia, and you must then travel back to Norfair for Wave Beam. The game communicates its general structure with the boss statues, outlining expectations so that leaving the boss lairs after their deaths is intuitive. The game will never expect you to return to a boss lair after the boss is defeated, so these levels are self-contained similarly to areas like Super's second half. Also similar to Super Metroid's method of signifying an upcoming backtrack, Zero shows you a heated room just after getting the high jump boots. Once you collect Varia, that heated room is in recent memory, so the destination is relatively clear. The only instance of untelegraphed extensive backtracking that I can really point to in Zero is needing to return all the way to Brinstar for the Varia suit. You can either use the Chozo Guide to outline exactly where your next destination is, or you can wander through a more obtuse and expansive chunk of the game world. Beyond that one instance, there really isn't much of anything too daunting in terms of navigation. Also similar to Super, Zero has a fair amount of restrictions on your navigation, typically in the form of one-way paths. Early on, it's fairly standard stuff, like locking you into this tunnel until you collect the long beam, placing this Tanglevine fruit until after you collect the power grip, using this one-way tunnel with rippers to lock you into Norfair until after you get the ice beam, this giant one-way drop in Kraid's lair, these falling blocks trapping you in Ridley's lair, and plenty more. Some of these can be bypassed, but most of them force you into a smaller area of the world. If the area that you're restricted to is small, such as when you're trapped near the long beam, then you won't be restricted for long. Other one-way paths, like the pit blocks that lead to the ensnared Kirugiru, will restrict you to a larger area for a much longer time. You can't leave Ridley's lair until Ridley dies, or if you die without saving. It's fair for someone to prefer something like NES or Prime 1's navigational freedom, because those games place your navigation entirely within your control. I know some people see navigational restrictions as some kind of Metroid sin, but I think it ultimately comes down to their implementation. They have a stronger presence here than they did in Super, but I'd still consider them inoffensive even at their worst. Love it or hate it, a defining trait of NES Metroid was that it refused to restrict your navigation, or inform you of your destination even in subtle ways. Basically, everything that you learned about Zebes, you learned through classic trial and error. If an early game player wandered into Norfair, the game was more than okay with throwing you to the wolves if you dared to wander in. NES Metroid Zebes is by far the most unwelcoming world in the series, and you feel that directly through the gameplay. It's the Metroid game with the most loose progression, the least restrictive navigation, and the harshest death penalty. This is far too daunting for many players, but it's also unique for offering an incredibly satisfying challenge to master. Part of the appeal of that original game is that it really doesn't care to make you feel welcome. It doesn't care to ease you in, and it doesn't care to guide you with an invisible hand. It might have a goal outlined in that you need to kill the two bosses, but even that shouldn't be taken for granted, since the game places in a fake Kraid to confuse the player. The cryptic design of NES Metroid is often considered one of the game's greatest weaknesses, but I think it's one of its greatest strengths. It might go a little too far in one or two places, but overall I love what NES Metroid is able to offer with its unwelcoming and unguided test of your abilities. I totally understand why people criticize this game for these reasons, but NES Metroid's navigational challenge is special to me. If there is anything that Zero fails to capture about the original experience, it's this commitment to a truly unguided and unwelcoming gameplay experience. Zero Mission ignores this aspect of the original game and replaces it with something equally valid on its own merits, but far less original. Taken on its own merits, Zero's navigational offering is pretty standard for Metroid. Given the incredibly high standards set by the series, that's a massive compliment to the game design. Similar to Super Metroid, Zero manages to be accommodating to newcomers with its mostly optional Chozo statues and streamlined progression, but also engaging to veterans with some of my favorite sequence breaks in the series. It's no secret nowadays, but Zero Mission's new epilogue segment is an exciting surprise for those uninitiated. Samus crashes her ship back on Zebes during her attempt to escape, and she's forced to sneak through 2 new levels called Chozodia and the Space Pirate Mothership. This new endgame epilogue is an interesting addition for how it completely shifts focus away from traditional Metroidvania gameplay in favor of something more centered on stealth and evasion. Samus is stripped of every ability earned through the game, and then some, equipped only with an emergency stun pistol. A fully charged shot may stun one enemy for a moment, but beyond that, you are entirely incapable of taking any offensive action against the many pirates of this area. Pirates will patrol the rooms, and you must carefully platform and navigate your way through while trying to avoid line of sight of any of the pirates. This complete gameplay shift expands on those smaller moments from Fusion, and it's clear that Zero's take on this gameplay concept is far more mechanically interesting for expanding on the SAX's unimpressive AI. I hardly even talked about the gameplay of the SAX encounters in Fusion because I felt like gameplay was never really the point of those parts, but here in Zero Mission it feels like they focused on expanding the gameplay of this formula. The pirates do not even have particularly interesting or advanced movement, but their placement in the world and general level design makes for a fine-tuned challenge. Evading and or hiding from the space pirates places heavy emphasis on the movement tech and platforming. If you're skilled enough to do so, you can disregard a slower and more methodical approach to carefully avoiding being spotted in favor of barreling through every segment to quickly make your escape. This requires an incredible understanding not only of the map and level design, but also a mastery of the controls to optimize your movement well enough to avoid the heaps of damage from the pirates. Zero is, again, finding yet another way to reward skilled play to those who are committed to mastering the movement tech and demonstrating one's knowledge of the world layout. Chozodia might be a completely different kind of gameplay experience, but it maintains a commitment to Zero's greater design goals that allow this deviation to feel mechanically cohesive with the rest of the game. I do not hesitate to jump on the bandwagon of adoring this part of Zero Mission. Upon completing the Ruins test in the top of Chozodia, Samus will receive all of her power-ups back. The 3 unknown items also become active, granting Samus the Plasma Beam, Gravity Suit, and Space Jump all at once. This moment is especially memorable for allowing you to feel the power dynamic shift as you now send the pirates into a panic. You can finally fight back as an even stronger Samus, and it scares the pirates enough for some of them to start hiding from you. Though I may tremendously enjoy Chozodia for its fresh and interesting stealth action gameplay, I can't help but think that things end up falling apart once you actually make it to the Ruins test. Despite the fact that you now have all of your abilities back, the actual level and world layout don't interconnect enough to make your backtracking feel very different from your initial trek. You just came all the way out here, and the game ends up mostly looping you back on that same path to ask you to do most of it backwards. Most of Chozodia is one massive serpentine hallway that occasionally loops on itself, and there aren't that many shortcuts that let you cut down on the repetition. It's cathartic to lay waste to the pirates in this part of the game, but they really didn't need to make you travel all the way back through almost all of Chozodia just to proceed. Power bombs aren't that far from where they're needed, but adding even more back and forth to this segment of the game is the last thing this game needs. I might be aware of the secret tunnel that skips needing power bombs, but I feel bad for everyone else that felt like they had to do more backtracking right at the end of the game. What makes Chozodia potentially frustrating is that the Space Pirate Mothership in particular is suddenly completely okay with cheap enemy placement. Space pirates often blindside you from off-screen out of nowhere, dealing tons of damage and never dropping health. This is mostly inoffensive in normal runs, but those of you that have attempted speedruns and challenges like low percent will likely know just how painful these moments of off-screen surprises can really be. These issues are small in comparison to the many positives that come from Chozodia's inclusion. On the whole, the new epilogue segment in Zero Mission is a great addition to the game for mixing up the gameplay with something incredibly unique and tense. Each subsequent 2D Metroid game further improves the level design, and Zero Mission is no exception. Zero offers a more deliberate placement of platforms, more thoughtful enemy placement, and an incredible variety of layouts. I especially enjoy how often Zero's levels reward using the power grip for satisfying platforming. Platforming in general is also the best of any of the games discussed so far, with the speedy and crunchy movement complementing the platform layouts well. Exclusive to this game, I also really enjoy searching around for these hidden morph ball speed booster cannons that blast you through the ceiling. It's satisfying to notice a vertical line of destructible tiles and figure out that one of these cannons is hidden at the bottom. They even see some interesting use with some light puzzle solving as well. There's a lot more to appreciate here, like these perfectly spaced blocks in Norfair that test your precision jumping, this ramp in Norfair that requires you to perform a speed boosting jump, this tunnel in Kraid that tasks you with blasting away pursuing enemies while you escape on a zipline. Countless subtle but intuitive secrets like this seemingly random space in Kraid that reveals the fake lava below, or enemies that obstruct your forward momentum more deliberately like these nests in Brinstar, or the speed booster puzzles like the entire right side shaft of Norfair. The more notable layouts from the original game return, such as the different boss statues, the 4 pipes at the top of Brinstar, the bubble columns of Norfair, the fake floors and fake acid pits, or the many generally similar areas. The developers went through the original game and handpicked every potentially interesting room layout to preserve, and otherwise rearranged every uninteresting layout into something new. For example, the infamous giant pillar in Kraid's lair has seen improvements by changing it from one of the required means of traversal to an optional set piece that rewards speedrunners with a potential shine-sparking shortcut. Plenty of designs and set pieces make each level cohesive between all rooms, such as Kraid's many long vertical and horizontal tunnels, the zipline across the ceilings, and the blockier general placement of tiles meant to represent this ancient structure. That contrasts well against something like Norfair's more naturalistic and irregular tile placement, its emphasis on specific mechanics like the speed booster shaft, and its variety of open and more claustrophobic rooms. Each level is characterized through subtle design cohesion within each level that makes them feel more unique, especially in comparison to the original game. Nearly every room in this game seems to be built with the idea that players should be able to move through these rooms quickly if they're skilled. Zero's speedrunning opportunities are especially well realized through level design that feels like it's eager to reward thoughtful use of advanced moves like the Shine Spark and the wall jump. This game even further improves secret searching with some new mechanics, like the fact that merely shooting a bombable tile now reveals that tile. Power bombs now also reveal false tiles as well, which further helps with secret searching. Zero Mission offers the best level design yet through its variety, its evolved utilization of familiar new mechanics, and its emphasis on rewarding skilled play. Zero's combat is as standard as it comes in 2D Metroid. All of the familiar enemy designs, weapons, health and ammo systems, everything is exactly as you'd expect it to be. All of the improvements made between Metroid 1 and 3 are on full display, with Chozo statues offering instant refills on health and ammo, for example. Enemy patterns are fairly basic and uninteresting, but that's great for a game so clearly unconcerned with emphasizing combat. As discussed in my Prime video, exploration-focused enemies act as obstructions to your momentum more than life or death challenges. All of the exploration-focused enemies are mechanically forgettable, so much so that I have nothing to say about them. The unfortunate thing is that Zero's entire enemy roster is made up of this kind of enemy design, with the only exceptions being things like the Kirogiro larvae, the Metroids, and the bosses. The Kirogiro larvae are interesting for being one of the only times the 2D games take a genuine attempt at designing a proper puzzle for the player, and I wouldn't mind seeing this kind of thing more often. You're unable to escape this room until you realize that you can use your bombs to damage this creature's soft underbelly. All of the pieces are there for the player to experiment and think critically until they reach that satisfying brain blast moment. It's nothing mind-blowing, but solid puzzle design is shockingly rare in the Metroid series, so I want to emphasize appreciation for when they nail this kind of thing. The Metroids are the only special kind of non-boss combat-focused enemy, and they're perhaps at their absolute best in this game. I thought they felt pretty underwhelming in Prime and Super, and it feels like Zero did everything that it needed to in order to make the Metroids feel threatening again. The Metroids finally returned to their former glory with design choices straight from the first two games. Metroids are lightning fast, difficult to shake off, they sap tons of health, and they sometimes like to attack in numbers. They do not stay frozen nearly as long as they did in Super Metroid, and they also outright ignore screw attack instead of being knocked away like in Super. Metroids are even more dangerous because of the fact that they now fly in from the background, meaning they can't only come from the edge of the screen like they did in the previous games. games. On top of all of that, the level design complements their placement with bombable floors that'll drop you right in front of several Metroids. You're given just enough time to see them flying in from the background for it to feel like your fault for messing up, even when they drop you in like this, so it doesn't feel cheap to me at all. This is by far the best gameplay experience the Metroid series has ever offered with the regular Metroid fights, and they pulled it off by reintroducing that incredible tension through their mechanical design. The bosses are such a massive disappointment in Zero Mission. Kraid and Ridley both borrow most of their attack patterns directly from Super Metroid, but now they do so with less health and less tension overall. They're both unoriginal and boring for being recycled pushovers. Ridley in particular is especially easy for dying almost immediately if you just stand there and pump him full of missiles. Easier encounters can work in video games if the skill ceiling is also pushed higher, but these bosses never really feel like there's much of any opportunity to flex your skill. They're just the same bosses you remember from Super, but now they go down in seconds. There's little to appreciate here with these two guys, and it doesn't get much better with any of the new mini-bosses. This worm is a fairly standard video game boss with a simple pattern of dodging his body and shooting his eye and spikes. The acid worm in Kraid's lair similarly has little going on with his attack pattern. The worm will attempt to grab you, and he'll briefly raise the acid level to get you to jump to a platform that's already right next to you. Again, just nothing exciting, no real phase variation beyond the worm becoming faster, nothing to sink my teeth into here. The tangled Kirugiru larva at least lets me use wall jumps to deal extra damage, which is finally a chance to demonstrate my abilities to aim and wall jump in a precise and rapid succession. The Imago in Ridley's lair simply flies back and forth, occasionally attempting to sting you. Pump missiles into his ass and he'll die without much trouble. Again, just another forgettable fight that barely attempts to put up a challenge, barely evolves, barely stands out in any way. Mother Brain is a more memorable fight as she is largely similar to her original design from the NES game. Focusing on all of the many projectiles flying around the room is overwhelming, and all the while Mother Brain will now fight back directly with a massive fireball from her eye. The knockback on this fireball is severe, and she'll also attack whenever you get back on the platforms. The platforms are less forgiving here as well. Even with the power grip, you'll find yourself far more likely to fall in the lava than you ever were in the NES game. There's a strange difficulty spike here that mostly comes from how chaotic and unforgiving these design choices are when they come together. Even to this day, I can still have speedruns end at the Mother Brain fight just because it's pretty easy for her to pelt you with 3 different kinds of projectiles. It often feels unfair because some of the projectiles show up at the perfect time together to be seemingly impossible to avoid, and I sometimes find this boss pretty frustrating because of that. Unfortunately, I think she's still the best boss fight in the game, because the 2 bosses following her are disappointing. The Ruins Test Chozo Ghost is remarkably simple. It flies in a figure 8 pattern, occasionally reveals a weak point, and sometimes strikes lightning. He might get faster, strike lightning more often, or add a shockwave effect to his lightning. This fight does evolve, but it wasn't particularly interesting to start with, so it ends up averaging out to being a good but not particularly great battle. The final boss disappoints me because they again staple Ridley into a segment he didn't need to be in. I feel strongly that the Metroid series has a too much Ridley issue, so adding yet another Ridley fight into a remake is unfortunate. Mecha Ridley is perhaps the most mechanically interesting battle in the game, but it's also a total pushover most of the time. I enjoy the precise timing required to hit the boss's weak point, and the attacks are each plenty varied from one another. Some might require you to shoot his missiles down, avoid his hand, alternate your positioning to evade the lasers, or maintain a space jump to stay in between the fireballs. Like Mother Brain, certain simultaneous attack combinations feel impossible to dodge. It's too bad they couldn't go further to make this fight more interesting or consistently fair. Bosses on the whole are perhaps better than games like Metroid 1, 2, or Prime for going by quickly and being inoffensive during normal runs. They're just mechanically engaging enough to beat those games out, but that's really not saying much. They're some of the worst bosses in the series, and that's especially disappointing after seeing what these designers were capable of in Fusion. Comparisons aside, these bosses even fail to be anything above mildly interesting at best, even on their own merits. Combat as a whole suffers pretty significantly because of the lacking challenge and mechanically lacking combat offering. 100%ing Zero Mission rewards the player with unique ending gallery images. I know some people are unhappy with me complaining about Samus's gallery images, stripping her down and giving us these glamour shots. Well, I'm not done bitching yet, because Zero again disappoints me. My issue with some of the Metroid games is that rewarding the player in this way feels tonally inconsistent with Metroid. I don't have an inherent problem with suggestive imagery in games, and these images are super tame, all things considered, but my bigger issue is that they're just plain boring boring, and I don't think they belong in Metroid specifically. Samus is rarely doing anything in these images besides standing there or whatever, so I find it difficult to enjoy the art itself. I like when the backgrounds give us a better look at Samus's home, or her life outside of the games. It's weird that the designers want us to believe that Samus goes to a bar in these shorts and vest, but I guess it's at least interesting to see Samus acting more like a normal person. The process of accounting for your progression is nearly identical to the offering found within Metroid Fusion. New Game Plus again offers item totals on a per level basis. Item icons change on the map depending on whether or not you've collected the item, and now you can even view the maps of other levels from wherever you want. Item checklists are still only in the New Game Plus instead of being there from the get-go, but we've come such an incredibly long way from how poorly things were handled in the NES game. Tracking your progression in this game is phenomenal. I do have one criticism that is true of every previous Metroid game, and that's the fact that there is no means of tracking items outside of the rooms that you've been to. Samus Returns allows you to fill out your map with the scan pulse according to your proximity, and Dread will highlight a large area white to indicate the general presence of an item. Each of these approaches prevent a problematic scenario that I often encounter in most Metroid games when trying to go for 100%. The map markers from Zero might indicate the presence of an item in a room you've already discovered, but that does nothing to help with the many hidden pathways leading to secret rooms. It can feel a bit obtuse when you've explored the entire map, but there are no item indicators on the map, and no means of narrowing where that item may be within a level. I especially like how Dread handles this because the white rectangles on the map are fairly large. It's the perfect balance of nudging me in the right direction, but leaving the rest to me. I don't think this is a huge deal either way, but I appreciate the slight nudge in the player's favor. I usually enjoy combing over the world, but doing it for every last item can get exhausting, so I'll gladly accept something like power bombs, X-ray scope, scan pulse, or the white rectangles on Dread's map. The intrinsic value of searching for the expansions in this game is somewhat of a mixed bag for a few reasons. To start with the good, the majority of the expansions are fun to search for, perhaps even some of the best of the series. Some of my favorites include Shinesparking through Torian, clearing the floor to make this enemy usable as a platform in Norfair, this little puzzle in Kraid with a zipline, and trying to race these collapsing tiles in Ridley. Much of the level design works well to test the player in a variety of interesting ways, such as these items that utilize the ziplines in Kraid's hideout. Plenty of other missile tanks reward observing subtleties in the environment, or sit at dead ends to challenge the player, perhaps with a little bit of platforming or something. There's a lot to appreciate here with how Zero challenges the player to acquire all the expansions, especially in comparison to the NES game that mostly just placed these out in the open. The problems start to come in once you begin to look at what were previously my favorite parts of Fusion, the Shinesparking challenges. I really enjoyed these in Fusion as a rare platforming challenge that tested the skilled player in a reasonable way. Zero dials these Shinesparking challenges up to 11, vastly increasing their difficulty. Normally I'd be open to appreciating a greater challenge, but my issue with Zero's take on this concept is that they made these Shinesparking challenges more annoying than engaging through their difficult design. Some of the time, these feel like pure trial and error, and executing on uber-picky button inputs. Take a look at this one energy tank before the final boss. I'm okay with having to execute in a precise and timely manner, but this is just ridiculous. Or this one missile tank in Ridley, where you have to perform a speed boosting jump in the most annoyingly precise manner possible. Take a look at this power bomb tank in Criteria that asks you to blindly diagonally shine spark to hope you happen to guess correctly for the item. Zero's speed boosting challenges task you with perfect positioning that can only be learned through guesswork, and it's tedious. It only gets worse when you factor in the pacing of the 100% run. Power bombs are given to the player at the very end of the game, just a few rooms away from the final boss. Collecting this first power bomb tank then forces the completionist to go back through the whole world to collect 8 more tanks. These are placed all over the world, so you're given a fairly large trek back through the world at the very end of the game. There are shortcuts to get around a bit faster with late game items, but the fact that so much is placed so late is certainly a pacing oddity. It's not as bad as Primes for being optional, and it's not as bad as Fusions for being much shorter, but this really didn't need to be here in the first place. If the game had provided me with the opportunity to sequence break for early power bombs, then perhaps there could have been some version of this game where a sequence breaking player could collect nearly everything as they go. This uneven pacing combined with the tedious Shinesparking challenges often demotivates me from even bothering with 100%ing this game most of the time. I couldn't blame even the most hardcore completionist for finding these issues to be unforgivable. It could be so much worse, but there's a lot to be disappointed with here. Speedrunning Zero Mission is completely insane. Much of the appeal has been alluded to in previous segments, but the obvious appeal comes from the snappy and fast movement. Like I said before, even basic movement feels so good in Zero, and there's hardly a dull moment with your traversal. As discussed in the level design, so much of this world is meticulously built to encourage you to utilize your movement techniques to shave off time. Bosses might be pushovers that die in seconds, but that ends up suiting a speedrun fairly well, since you're speeding on through. The non-linear world and item progression also contribute massively towards vast opportunities to optimize your routing and minimize unnecessary item collection. You want just enough items to get you through the game, and it's up to you to determine what you can and can't afford to skip. So much of what goes into speedrunning this game is just planning your route meticulously. It's everything I loved about Super Metroid speedrunning and more. I suspect that many people ultimately prefer speedrunning Super Metroid because of things like its many excellent glitchy time-saving opportunities, whereas Zero doesn't really have as many glitches. Things like Zero's superior movement and platforming make me ultimately prefer this over even Super Metroid speedrunning. Zero might have a lower skill floor with its more accessible navigation and pushover bosses, but its speedrun and sequence breaking potential skyrocket the skill ceiling to new height. Because the speedrunning potential adds so much to a second playthrough, the replay value of this game is unfathomably high. Zero Mission is one of my most replayed games of all time, and it's primarily because of the incredible speedrunning potential. Even aside from speedrunning this game, the nuances in the movement tech, the general potential for routing optimizations, the 100% gallery images, the sub 2 hours images, the low percent run images, the difficulty options, the many sequence breaks, there's just so much to do on a second, third, or 100th playthrough. Zero Mission also has unique gallery images just for beating the game with 15% items or less on normal and hard mode. I don't usually dedicate a segment of my videos just for the low percent run, but since Zero is the only game in the series that acknowledges this run, I'll take some time to discuss this challenge, especially since Zero is endorsing this challenge as a recognized and deliberately designed aspect of the game. I think that means that it carries more significance than it would otherwise. The unfortunate thing about Zero's low percent run is that it is by far the worst experience I've ever had in a video game. On the one hand, I really like the fact that the game world offers all of these secret pathways to make this run possible. It's a ton of fun to search the world carefully for means of bypassing many of the items. This even further expands the sequence breaking opportunities. The player can beat this game with as few as 9 items, and this is how I decided to complete this challenge a couple years ago. I recently decided to try the hard mode version, but I decided to opt for the full 15% because I don't hate myself enough to suffer any further than that. Low percent is memorable for limiting my explorable area, testing me to really think carefully about how to route my navigation efficiently to minimize exposure to enemies. Especially with such a small array of combat and movement options, you really learn to make the best with what little you have. It's a ton of fun. This extent of bypassable items in such a sequenced progression path remains unique to Zero, and I'd love to see this return one day. Everything I've discussed so far is phenomenal, but the fatal flaw comes from the boss fights. Plenty of bosses are hardly worth talking about, like the mini-bosses and Kraid, but the 3 that really make this run tedious are the 2 Ridley battles and Mother Brain. The problem with the 2 Ridley fights in particular is that they both require you to complete a somewhat lengthy stretch of gameplay to get back into the action, and this tedious gameplay accounts for a massive chunk of my playtime when I'm retrying these boss fights. I find it insanely tedious to replay these mindless gameplay segments over and over for no good reason. What really makes the fights themselves insufferable in all 3 cases is that the lack of missiles leaves you with few options. You're forced into a scenario where your only choice is to farm for missiles against each boss, and that almost certainly entails grinding. You're stuck waiting for the boss to use their one attack that might drop you more ammo. I believe words will never be able to fully describe the suffering that Mecha Ridley in particular has caused me. I don't mind a challenging game. I'll even accept some tedium and frustration, but nothing compares to the RNG-induced frustration that I feel when rolling the dice against Mecha Ridley. Mecha Ridley has a bunch of attacks that can each be theoretically dodged, but some of them have a chance to happen at the same time. Certain combinations of attacks will guarantee a hit, and thus another trek through that tedious stretch of gameplay of merely returning to the boss room. You gotta wait for Ridley to slowly crawl back into frame, and you then proceed to wait for the missiles to replenish your ammo. You're not only waiting for the boss to finally do its one attack to possibly drop missiles, but you're also hoping that the boss will not decide to just kill you out of nowhere whenever it feels like it. If Mecha Ridley's arm is in the right position to block your shots, then the stars can align to make it seemingly impossible to defend yourself against the oncoming missiles, as the arm is blocking you from shooting the missiles out of the air. I'm no stranger to spending dozens of hours grinding out a segment of a game that could be beaten in just a couple minutes, depending mostly on RNG to finally give in. But Zero's low percent has easily been the most unpleasant. The worst part of the whole scenario is my previously mentioned issue with the space pirates in the mothership. Especially on hard mode, you are given a limited time to quickly reach the escape ship. Every space pirate can one-hit kill you from off-screen in a split second, so your only viable option is trial and error combined with memorization. During the escape, there are 26 pirates, 5 atomics, and 2 elites that can all easily kill you in an instant. You need to know where each of those enemies are, and you need to know exactly what to do, or you will die. So in order to commit those pirate locations to memory, you need a successful defeat of Mecha Ridley every single time you want a chance to memorize more. I have hours of footage of me grinding out Mecha Ridley, eventually finally beating him just to go out and die to learn how to manipulate the pirates into a consistent kill spot. To make it even worse, these 3 atomics usually decide to just hang out inside the door frame. They can't one-hit you like the space pirates can, but they can and will kill you whenever they feel like it. You don't have much time to stop and wait for them, and you don't have the ammo to dispatch them from a safe distance, so your only viable strategy is to run for it and roll the RNG dice. The 2 elite pirates at the very end are horrendously designed. Their AI is so clearly not made for any strategic or methodical combat. They just run at you and spam their beam. They have an absurd amount of health, so there's no strategy to kill them outside of exploiting their AI. Zero Mission's low percent run is so abysmally fucking awful that it feels like it was formulated to make me suffer. I hope that nothing ever comes close to the genuinely abhorrent experience I had suffering through this challenge. I've had unpleasant experiences with low percenting games like Prime and Return of Samus, but even those do not compare to the shit factor on display here. And at least in those games, I can understand that attempting such a challenge is not endorsed by the designers. It's ultimately my own fault for opting into that challenge in the first place, but the Zero Mission developers specifically designed their levels around making low percent viable, and put in special gallery images just for the low percent challenge. They seemingly recognize the low percent run as a legitimate challenge, but the boss fights feel deliberately designed to make low percent players suffer. I only even attempted this run a second time on hard mode years later because I afforded myself those extra 6 items to hit 15%. That made a huge difference, but the experience is still nowhere near approaching a recommendation. Stay away from low percent, it's yucky. Zero Mission doesn't just deliver on that classic Metroid gameplay, but it also succeeds with modernizing the original NES game. Everyone has their own idea on what exactly defines an ideal remake, but for me personally, I cannot identify a consistent through line in philosophy. I simply take it case by case. By all conventional wisdom, Zero Mission may as well replace the NES game for most fans of the series. With that said, I can't help but think that Zero is too different from the NES game for me to agree with this notion. There are significant differences with how these games approach the story, navigation, and progression in particular that I really like about the original game as its own thing. There's an open simplicity with a minimal focus on item progression, and a world shrouded in complete mystery in the NES game. Zero Mission does so much to improve on the original game. And while I strongly prefer Zero overall, I can't help but also take notice of the things that make the NES game remain unique as its own thing. I'd even straight up say that the story and lore of the original game are far superior, as far as I'm concerned. As a game on its own merits, Zero Mission is simply among the best in the entire series. Much of what Zero does is hardly original to this game, seeing as it borrows so much from Metroid 1 and 3. This game is also a mechanical sequel to Fusion that is somewhat unconcerned with innovating the formula, and more so trying to refine what came before. Old mechanics are brought back after being missing from Prime and Fusion, like the fast-paced gameplay with high replay value, minimalist story, and sequence breaking. Zero executes on all of these concepts exceptionally well, and does so as one of the best titles in the entire series. Zero does fumble plenty of things like its underwhelming bosses, lackluster 100% pacing, and blatant trial and error speed booster challenges, harming the world building and narrative of Metroid, and its irritating endgame enemy behaviors and cheap enemy placement. Even with these issues, Zero Mission is nothing short of a masterpiece for its refinement of what was already an incredibly addicting and well-executed gameplay formula. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and I thank you for taking the time to watch. Smell you later, Stinky. Wait, I forgot to talk about